Doctor, we're losing him. Charge at 50%. Clear. Today on the Knowing God podcast.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Knowing God podcast. I'm John.
And I'm Caleb.
And we are not giving medical advice today.
No. Well, he might be a doctor. He's not a medical physician.
Not that kind of doctor. No, we wouldn't give you medical advice, and that would be about worth what you pay for it. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're going to spend the next few weeks talking about the issues of what's called revitalization as it comes to church, as well as planting churches.
Right.
And so we're going to kind of talk a little bit about this issue of what it means to really start afresh in a church. So we, looked at these last few months, the doctrine of the church and various doctrines of the church. And I think we've made, at least I like to think that we've made a compelling argument that church is important.
It is.
And it's vital to the health of an individual. Now we're going to take a little bit more kind of bigger picture view of looking at what about the health of congregations.
Correct.
And how do we get to a place of health? So what are your thoughts on the word revitalization? Let's kind of just start there and kind of just think about some definitions. When I say revitalization, what comes to mind?
Yeah, so I would say that revitalization would be to take a church that might be waning, or declining, and I think there's a lot of different metrics, and you'll talk about that you can talk about when we're talking about when you're talking about. See, I can say that like a million times. But whenever we're on the subject of church revitalization, attendance and giving and effectiveness in the community, there's so many different ways that we can frame that. But whenever the church begins to wane, saying we realize this, we recognize this, now we want to turn the ship around, we want to go in the opposite direction, we see that we are declining, how do we now turn back into a place of growth, of health, of gospel witness in the community?
Yeah, there's a lot of things that we need to say kind of on the front end of this discussion. Might be a good place to start just with my own personal journey here and kind of just share a little bit about that. So you're getting ready to plant a church in the next year, and there was a time in my life that I was seriously considering being a church planter myself, and that was something that my wife and I, my family, we were kind of working through and talking about. But when we talk about planting and we talk about revitalization, it's kind of two sides of the same coin.
Correct.
They're similar, but they're different enough. And I think with my own internal wiring and just my own self-discovery and kind of who I am personally, I think I'm more of a revitalizer. And so let's kind of talk a little bit about just the difference of maybe a revitalization pastor and a church planter. So what are some things that come to your mind?
So I think one of the things is where your tolerances lie. Like where you have patience. Sometimes it's the difference between, do you have patience to start something from the ground up and realize that you're going to have to start small and have very few resources and kind of have to, patchwork things together, what my dad likes to call Southern engineering, just kind of make it work, do whatever. And it's definitely not up to code, but you got to, make things happen.
We call that Aggie engineering.
Aggie engineering. Okay, see, there you go. All right. Or you have, the other end, I think, where you have church revitalizers, and they really have a heart for what has been established and for making it bloom again, for something that has been there, that maybe has a long history of gospel witness, and their patience lies in that gently walking people through that process of, hey, this is where we're at, this is the reality of the way things are, but this is where things could be, and that patience to kind of bring people from point A to point B. So I think you have to have tolerances in different areas to really say, am I going to work through that kind of scarcity and make things work from there, or from that, hey, we have these things, but people have maybe a different vision of where the church is and where it should go.
Yeah, that's good. I think it's kind of pick your pain points, pick your poison, and that's why I think these are two sides of the same coin of planting and revitalizing. There are different ways of going about essentially the same issue of kind of bringing something to health and bringing something to maturation. Another thing to say here when it comes to churches, churches have life cycles. And that's something that a lot of times isn't readily acknowledged. If you're going to a local church, if you're a member of a church, you may not be thinking about this too much, but churches kind of operate on this parabola, and sometimes it's a rocket shot up and then it's a quick decline down. And those are the churches that unfortunately don't make it, the plants that maybe start really aggressively, go really high, and then, crater.
Right.
And we know, and the old adage, and I don't think this is true. I mean, we're going to talk about planting in a few weeks, but 80% of churches that are planted don't make it. I don't think that's true anymore. There's a lot more, better resources out there for church planters.
And it depends on how you define planting as well. I mean, there's a big thing there as well. So.
But when it comes to life cycles of churches, a lot of times you kind of get to a point, and churches as organizations will kind of come to like a crest, and then eventually they'll start that decline. And that decline is felt in terms of, preservation of the past, preservation of what we've done. The systems are kind of locked in, the way that we do church, just the culture is established. And if that is not monitored and addressed, eventually that leads to decline. And decline is felt in a number of ways. I mean, I think the most obvious is attendance.
Right.
I think mean or average age of attendee or member, I think that's where you're going to feel some of the decline. Another obvious pinch point is going to be when it comes to finances, a decline of church finances and giving. Ironically, I think what happens is for a lot of churches that maybe that attendance decline is felt before you have a decline in the financial aspect of the church, because what happens is, I think, as people have been part of a church for several decades, for 40, 50 years, some of them, they've been trained and discipled really well to be faithful givers to the church.
Right.
Or maybe they're homebound and they're still supporting the church. That's another a potential reality. And so sometimes the decline in attendance, we're still operating and paying the bills, we're fine, and then it can happen very, very quickly.
Definitely. I had a pastor who kind of said one of the metrics for how healthy your church is are you getting your arms wet? Are you baptizing people? Is there kind of that rejuvenation and regeneration of people's lives coming in? And I think that's another thing you see in church revitalization, is that sometimes you have a group of amazing saints, people who really love the Lord, but you're not seeing not only numerical growth, you see that plateaued, but you're really not seeing that outward focus, that gospel ministry happening to people who are far from God, coming in and being transformed by the gospel. So
I think another challenge when it comes to revitalization, every context is different. And if you're a pastor listening to this, it needs to be said that, think about your own context of ministry, and the vast majority of churches are in need of some degree of revitalization. Some churches, it's obvious. You have 10 people, and you're a pastor that's called, you're the last home run attempt, that they're throwing the Hail Mary. They're hoping that you as the pastor can bring this church back to glory and to maturity and flourishing. And so, you've got 10, 15 people, maybe a handful of families to work with.
Right.
The vast majority, I think, of us don't operate in that context. You're looking at signs of need of revitalization that aren't as readily obvious, And so as we think about our own church context here at our church, Metropolitan, I've been here for about 4 years, and I think there are aspects of revitalization that were necessary and evident to me, but may not have been as evident to some of the people in the church.
Correct. And I mean, I think that's standard practice, right?
Right.
Even if you look at just an individual's health, right, of saying, are you okay? You don't look like you're maybe, your color's off. It looks like you maybe gained some weight. You're not getting around as well as you used to, and things that maybe happen slowly over time to your body that you don't even notice. And then all of a sudden someone from the outside says, I don't think you're okay. And you think, wow, maybe you're right. It's sometimes you need that outside perspective of somebody to say, there might be something wrong here. And that's not just true, in the church. It's true in a lot of different ways. And so coming in from the outside and not having been a part of here, you can see the wonderful things absolutely that are going on in the church, but you also have the opportunity to see, I think these are some points that show that there might be some areas of unhealth that are going on in this organization. So.
Yeah, that's good. And sometimes too, if somebody might say, hey, I'm noticing that you're not as healthy as you once were, you seem like, weight gain is a good example. I think we've all felt that to some degree. It can be offensive,
right?
And you can get really defensive, and you're like, well, what do you mean?
Right. You're calling me fat? Like, what's going on here?
Exactly. And so that can cause a lot of problems. So when it comes to some of the literature and some of the things that are out there, we are actually living in a time that there's a lot of resources available for church revitalization. And so we've seen really an exponential growth in terms of things like podcasts. One of the podcasts I listen to, just put a plug for Tom Rainer, Replant, Revitalize. That's a really, really good resource. You mentioned like Carey Nieuwhof in one of our conversations. He has written extensively on revitalization. Mark Clifton. I mean, there's a lot of really, really good resources out there. Tom Rainer, I think, is a leading kind of visionary when it comes to this that has helped a lot of people.
Absolutely. And so we could say with that, I think that if you are in a revitalization context, maybe you're part of a congregation, maybe you're a pastor, you're not alone in that. Your church isn't the only church that's experienced maybe some decline, that's experienced some pain points, that's trying to figure out how to reach the next generation. You're not on an island. You're not the only one. There are a lot of resources. There are other people going through this. And so just don't feel like, you're weird. You're the only church in the world that's ever experienced this, and now you're alone having to do this. But there are so many churches out there that are experiencing this and that are working now towards becoming more effective, more healthy, and honestly just a better gospel witness in their community.
Yeah, I think you just said something that I really want to pinpoint and kind of just target. When we talk about church revitalization, you can get caught up in the metrics, and the metrics are very, very important, and you need to be cognizant and aware of the metrics in your church. But it's not about numbers. Numbers are people, and the real goal of church revitalization is church health, not church size or church growth. And the church growth movement was really kind of sparked in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and it's really, I think, waned quite a bit in the literature. And I think the focus has appropriately been more extended to this idea of church health. When it comes to the word revitalization, that might not be a word that everybody uses, but we all kind of know what that is. There are other synonyms out there like U-turn church, comeback churches, replant is another word that's sometimes used. And so just again, very succinctly, very simply, it's taking that which is in decline and seeing it come back to fruitfulness. You did mention, though, some metrics that I think are important to look at. And I love what did you say about your arms being wet? Say that again.
You got to get your arms wet. Are you seeing that external focus of people first time baptisms and those things, people coming in from the outside who are far from Christ now coming close to know.
That's good. Yeah. So adult baptisms are something that you want to look at for metrics in terms of a need for revitalization, attendance patterns, financial commitments, how many small groups. One of the metrics for health, I think, in a church is, are you developing new groups and new leaders, or are you kind of existing within the framework of the small group structures that you have, and is there a resistance to starting new groups for whatever reason?
Correct.
Community involvement is another thing. Do you reach out to your community? So in our next podcast, when we get into this a little bit deeper, we're going to be looking at some hows of revitalization.
Right.
But I think for our purpose here, we really want to kind of stay in the time that we have left and just kind of talking about the need. So anywhere from about 80 to 90% of churches are either declining or plateaued.
Right.
And that's often a quote, or often kind of a statistic that's said, and I think there's a lot of merit to it.
Definitely. And since COVID, we know that there's probably, even just anecdotally, I know that on my block where I live, when we moved in 2 years ago, right at the beginning of COVID, I can name 4 church buildings that were right there within a mile of my house. And now there are 2 of them that are just barely hanging on. One of them is now a Hindu temple that was a church before, and the other one is like Sacred Light Spiritual Center. So we've seen that. I think COVID has had a massive impact, but there was an epidemic before. There was an epidemic of churches declining and failing and having issues before COVID, and so COVID, I think, advanced some of that stuff. So now we're at this point where there are a lot of churches who are really struggling and really saying we need to do things differently. We need some maybe different like you said, metrics to be able to figure out how we can get healthy, and some different strategies. We can't just keep doing things the way we've been doing.
Well, and I think too, this is kind of typical for maybe somebody who gets in their older years. Sometimes too, the mentality creeps in where, we're not going to be able to survive, so let's just ride this thing out to the very end.
Yeah. If we can't do church the way that we've always done church, then let's just not do it.
Yeah. And COVID, again, like you said, was this accelerant. It didn't change anything particularly, but we saw some things in our culture accelerate. And so some of the things that we've seen in our churches, people value in our culture church less and less. Church attendance, is not quite as valuable as it once was. As you walk down the generations and you kind of go into like Gen X, the millennials, the Gen Zs, we are seeing less and less engagement with church as you continue. The traditionalists and the baby boomers, they do value church attendance by and large, statistically more.
Correct.
But as you go, and so again, COVID just accelerated this.
Definitely. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that looking at that, one of the things we can say is that if you are in a place where you're trying to revitalize, where you're part of a congregation or you're a pastor and you're in the middle of that, you do have some benefits. A lot of the people who maybe were there just nominally, you know, COVID has kind of the people who just showed up because they thought it was part of what they were supposed to do. A lot of those people are gone now. So hopefully, you know, even if you have a small core, it's a core of people who are committed, people who are dedicated to the work of that church. So I think there's even some good things now to say. You at least have a core to rebuild from, right?
That's a really, really good point. Another challenge that we see in our culture is the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And that simply means that there is, you know, there's a subset of our population that subscribe to no official religion or no tradition of faith practice, you know, that they are none. And as many as 25% in our culture identify with being a nun.
Right. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we need to revitalize churches. It's one of the reasons why we need to plant churches, as we'll talk about later, is because we're not talking about transfer growth. We're not just talking about going from church A to church B. We're talking about an entire generation and a huge subset of the population that has no connection to church whatsoever. And we need to position ourselves as churches, as houses of worship, as places that are the lighthouse of the gospel to be able to reach those who are far from Christ. And we need healthy churches to be able to do that.
And that's extremely difficult. You know, another thing that we should say on the front end of any discussion of revitalization, as well as planting, is it's hard.
Yeah.
It is hard work. I saw a quote, you know, Tom Rainer said that as much as maybe 2% of revitalization efforts are successful.
Right.
the odds are stacked against you.
They definitely are.
Yeah, I've heard this, you know, it's easier to have babies than to raise the dead.
Yeah, I would say that is true.
So let's get a little bit in our last few minutes together. Why? You know, why do we care? You know, if this is so difficult, why not just plant churches? Why focus on revitalization? I think the first thing that needs to be said is that this is a stewardship issue. You know, you mentioned churches in your community that have closed or transitioned to be, you know, false gospel churches, bars, you know, dance halls, concert venues.
Absolutely.
I mean, anything, you know. And so as we think about churches that exist that are in need of revitalization and new health, this is a stewardship issue for us as pastors.
It is.
You know, we look at these churches, they have existing structures, they have buildings, they have a presence in the community. There are people that are still there, and so how do we steward them well?
Absolutely. And I think just the fact that you know, you might be a church on the corner of a neighborhood and it's been there for 50 years. There's something to say about that. There's something to say about a building being a witness in the community for 50 years. And I think there's something that maligns the Christian faith whenever that stops being a church and becomes a restaurant, or becomes, you know, or just sits vacant with nobody there and the weeds grow up around it, whatever it is. I think that there's definitely something that, like you said, is a stewardship issue whenever we allow those places that we say this is a place of life transformation, you know, for years, and then now all of a sudden it sits vacant. It becomes something different. It's no longer what generations have poured resources in to make it. So,
and tell a story. So a few years ago, I ran across, there's a blog or website here in OKC, okctalk.com, and it kind of focuses on just the different developments, you know, that are going around town, and well, it usually focuses on restaurants. But one of the things that they showed a picture, there was a church located, and I won't exactly say the name of the church or the location, but kind of close to, you know, north of downtown.
Right.
And the church was an established church, had been an established church, had at one point been a very healthy church, and the picture that they had on their website was the church being dismantled by a wrecking crew, you know, to basically take that facade down, and it was being transitioned from a church, and the building was being leveled, to now being a shopping center. And one of the most telling things for me is to read through the comments.
Right.
There was not a lot of people that were grieving that.
Right.
There was quite a bit of celebration.
Right.
Tells you where our church is, or where our community is in terms of church. But also what was really interesting is there were people that were commenting that were part of that church, you know, and that had really kind of been the siren call that, hey, we need to change, we need to revitalize, we need to adapt. And there was a resistance to that change, and I think it happened very, very quickly.
Right. as it often does.
Yeah.
So I think that as we kind of wrap up today, just know that next week we'll get into the practicalities of what these look like, the things that are needed. But we do want to say to those who maybe are in a church that's been really impacted, those pastors out there who are struggling, maybe you're a part of a congregation or an elder board or a deacon team or just a member, and you're trying to figure out how your church can be healthy, that there are resources. There's a lot of things out there, and it's worth the pain. And it might be painful, might be difficult, but at the end, if it results in a healthy church, that's what this world needs. We need more healthy churches that will spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so we're excited about the next episode of Knowing God, and we will see you then. We love you guys.